China's foreign ministry says the U.S. seizure of foreign vessels violates international law, according to Reuters. At a press briefing, spokesperson Lin Jian said the U.S. practice of arbitrarily seizing other countries' vessels violates international law, Reuters reported. It's a notable escalation in rhetoric, with Beijing framing the seizure as a legal issue rather than simply a policy disagreement. Beijing is challenging the legal basis of the U.S. move, while the White House says the tanker carried sanctioned oil. The statement from China's foreign ministry represents a significant diplomatic intervention in what might otherwise be seen as a bilateral U.S.-Venezuela dispute. Lin also said China opposes unilateral sanctions it sees as lacking UN Security Council authorization, according to reports of the briefing. This framing is consistent with China's broader foreign policy position. Beijing has long argued that only UN Security Council authorized sanctions carry binding force in international law. Some governments and critics argue U.S. sanctions have cross-border effects that impact third parties not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. The United States argues its sanctions are legitimate exercises of sovereign authority. China's position is not unique. Many countries, particularly in the global south, have expressed similar concerns about the extraterritorial reach of U.S. sanctions. The disagreement over sanctions reflects a fundamental divide over how international order should function. The United States has historically taken the position that it has the sovereign right to impose and enforce sanctions regardless of UN authorization. Washington views sanctions as a tool of foreign policy that does not require multilateral approval. China and other countries argue that without Security Council backing, such measures lack legitimacy under international law. They view unilateral sanctions as a form of economic coercion. This debate is not new, but the seizure of tankers has brought it back into sharp focus. The confrontation highlights a broader question: who gets to set the rules of international trade and navigation? By framing the seizure as a violation of international law, Beijing is elevating this from a bilateral dispute to a question of global governance. This is a deliberate rhetorical strategy. China is positioning itself as a defender of international law and the rules-based order, a framing that challenges U.S. claims to the same position. The diplomatic language is notable. China is not simply expressing disagreement with U.S. policy. It is accusing the United States of breaking the law. Whether this framing gains traction internationally remains to be seen, but it signals that China views this issue as significant enough to warrant a public confrontation. China's statement invoked the UN Charter, the foundational document of international order. The Charter establishes norms, including sovereign equality of states and non-intervention in domestic affairs. China is arguing that U.S. seizures of vessels violate these principles, though the United States disputes this interpretation. The reference to the UN Charter is significant. It frames the dispute not as a disagreement between two countries, but as a question of whether the United States is violating the fundamental rules that govern international relations. This is a powerful rhetorical move designed to appeal to countries that value the UN system and are wary of unilateral U.S. action. China's foreign ministry explicitly defended Venezuela's right to international trade. According to reports, the spokesperson said Venezuela has the right to independent development and mutually beneficial cooperation with other countries. Beijing also expressed belief that the international community understands and supports Venezuela's position in safeguarding its legitimate rights and interests. This is a direct response to U.S. efforts to restrict Venezuela's oil exports. China is signaling that it views trade with Venezuela as legitimate, regardless of what the United States says. For Beijing, the principle at stake is clear. Countries should be able to trade with whomever they choose without interference from third parties. The diplomatic confrontation was sparked by a specific incident. Reuters reports the U.S. Coast Guard intercepted a China-bound tanker off Venezuela. The vessel was operating in what the White House has described as a blockade zone targeting sanctioned tankers traveling to or from Venezuela. The interception occurred in international waters in Piracy, a point that critics have highlighted in questioning U.S. jurisdiction. The timing of the seizure is also notable. It came as the Trump administration has been escalating pressure on Venezuela through a declared blockade of oil shipments. The tanker was carrying about 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan Merey crude, Reuters reported. This is a significant cargo. Venezuelan crude is among the most valuable resources in the Western Hemisphere. China has been a major purchaser of Venezuelan oil despite U.S. sanctions. The trade relationship has helped sustain the Venezuelan economy in the face of Western pressure. The seizure represents both an economic loss for Venezuela and a disruption to energy trade with China. For Venezuela, oil exports are the primary source of foreign exchange. Disrupting those exports threatens the government's ability to pay for imports and maintain basic services. The seizure occurred in international waters, and the fact that has drawn significant attention. Under traditional interpretations of maritime law, the high seas are open to all nations. Vessels have the right to navigate freely without interference from other states. There are recognized exceptions for piracy, slave trading, and vessels without nationality. But the legal basis for seizing vessels based on unilateral sanctions in international waters is disputed. Critics argue that the United States is asserting jurisdiction beyond its legal authority. Supporters argue that sanctions enforcement is a legitimate exercise of sovereign power. The legal debate is unlikely to be resolved by this incident, but it highlights fundamental disagreements about the rules governing international shipping. Venezuela's response was sharp. The Venezuelan government described the U.S. military move as a serious act of international piracy. Caracas rejected U.S. justifications for the seizure. It termed the operation theft, hijacking, and a serious act of international piracy. Calling it piracy is meant to frame the seizure as one of the most serious crimes at sea, an attempt to reframe the narrative with the U.S. as lawbreaker rather than enforcer. The rhetorical strategy is clear. Venezuela wants the world to see the United States not as enforcing international norms, but as violating them. The incident involving the China-bound tanker was not isolated. The U.S. also seized another tanker, the Skipper, as part of a broader crackdown that later expanded into a declared blockade of sanctioned tankers. Reports indicate that U.S. forces seized a second tanker near Venezuelan territory. Venezuela says this is no coincidence, but Trump's strategy aimed squarely at Venezuelan oil. The pattern of seizures suggests a sustained campaign rather than a one-time enforcement action. The United States appears to be systematically targeting vessels involved in Venezuelan oil trade. The seizures follow President Trump's announcement of what he described as a total and complete blockade of sanctioned tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem confirmed that U.S. forces seized a tanker in a pre-dawn operation, an action she openly framed as enforcement against Venezuelan oil. The language of blockade is significant. In international law, blockades are typically associated with armed conflict. The use of this term has drawn attention to the aggressive nature of U.S. actions. However, questions remain about the legal basis for these seizures. It is unclear whether all seized vessels were on U.S. sanctions lists at the time of interception. Critics argue that seizing vessels not on sanctions lists raises serious questions about legal authority. If a vessel is not sanctioned, what gives the United States the right to seize it? The Trump administration has framed its actions as enforcement against a shadow fleet of vessels evading sanctions. But critics say this framing stretches legal authority beyond its limits. Venezuela raised additional concerns about the crew of seized vessels. The Venezuelan government claimed that the crew of one private vessel had been forcefully disappeared. This is a serious allegation. If true, it would raise significant humanitarian and legal concerns about the treatment of civilian mariners. Washington has publicly said the tanker carried sanctioned oil, but has not specifically addressed Venezuela's allegation about the crew. The status and treatment of crew members remains unclear from public reporting. This is an issue that may attract further scrutiny as the situation develops. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has framed the seizures as part of a broader U.S. campaign against his government. Earlier this week, Maduro accused Washington of seeking to install a puppet government that would surrender Venezuela's constitution, sovereignty, and resources. He described the blockade and vessel seizures as corsair tactics and a reference to pirates and part of a diplomacy of barbarism. Venezuela has also alleged that the seizure of oil tankers is part of Washington's broader campaign to overthrow the Maduro government. This framing presents U.S. actions not as sanctions enforcement, but as economic warfare aimed at regime change. Venezuela has threatened to escalate the dispute to international bodies. Caracas says it will take the matter to the United Nations Security Council and other multilateral organizations. Whether this will produce results is uncertain. The United States holds veto power on the Security Council, making it unlikely that any resolution critical of Washington would pass. However, the move could still serve to publicize Venezuela's position and build support among other nations critical of U.S. sanctions policy. Venezuela may also pursue action in other forums, such as the International Court of Justice or regional bodies, where U.S. influence is less dominant. The United States has offered its own justification for the actions. A U.S. official stated, "Our goal is regional stability and security in the national interest of the United States." The official continued, "The national interest of the United States, specifically when it comes to Venezuela, is as follows. We have a regime that's illegitimate, that cooperates with Iran, that cooperates with Hezbollah, that cooperates with narco-trafficking and narco-terrorist organizations. This framing presents U.S. actions as driven by security concerns rather than economic interests." The U.S. official cited the presence of armed groups, the ELN and FARC dissidents, operating inside Venezuelan territory as part of the justification. The official also pointed to alleged Venezuelan cooperation with Iran and Hezbollah, both designated by the United States as threats to national security. This framing presents U.S. actions as counterterrorism and counter-narcotics measures rather than simply sanctions enforcement. Critics argue this framing is designed to justify aggressive action by linking Venezuela to familiar U.S. adversaries. The incident raises significant legal questions that are unlikely to be resolved quickly. Under international law, the high seas are generally considered open to all nations. Vessels have the right to navigate freely without interference. There are exceptions for certain crimes, but the legal basis for boarding vessels in international waters based on unilateral sanctions is disputed. The United States argues its actions are legitimate sanctions enforcement. Critics, including China and Venezuela, argue they constitute unlawful interference with international shipping. The lack of UN Security Council authorization for U.S. sanctions against Venezuela is central to China's legal argument. This fundamental disagreement reflects deeper tensions about who gets to set the rules of the global order. The confrontation over Venezuelan oil tankers is part of a broader contest over international rules. China's intervention signals that Beijing views this as more than a U.S.-Venezuela dispute. It is framing the issue as a question of global order, whether one country can impose its will on the high seas. For Venezuela, the stakes are economic survival. Oil exports are the country's primary source of foreign exchange. Disrupting those exports threatens the government's ability to function. For the United States, the goal, as stated by officials, is to pressure the Maduro government and address what Washington sees as security threats in the region. Whether Trump's blockade will achieve its objectives remains to be seen. Previous U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have not produced regime change. Critics argue they have primarily harmed ordinary Venezuelans while strengthening the government's narrative of external victimization. What is clear is that the seizure of oil tankers has escalated tensions between major powers. China has publicly criticized Washington. Venezuela is mobilizing diplomatic opposition, and the United States shows no sign of backing down. The confrontation raises deeper questions about the future of international order. In a world where major powers disagree on fundamental rules, incidents like this can become flashpoints for broader conflict. For now, the tankers have been seized, the oil will not reach its destination, and the diplomatic battle continues.